You got the date?
Yeah, the date's up.
Okay. Oh, it's heavier than I thought. Well, good morning to everyone. I'm sure everyone is experiencing a great deal of, pressure, anxiety, pushes towards deeper prayer, interiority, solitude, and silence. And so I want you to know that we at the monastery are praying for our friends, families, our close associates, and certainly you and your families. So it's challenging times, but it's in challenging times like this, I think, that great things can happen. So I'm not entirely pessimistic, even though it's in many ways tragic. Today is Monday, March 30th, and this is the lecture intended for the class which wants to have met Saturday, April 4th. So I'm not sure when you'll get this. We'll send it off to Tom Kuski either later this afternoon or tomorrow morning. So you'll see how it gets distributed to you. Also, as I'm talking today, I'm hoping to get into your hand by the time you see the DVD, a rather large handout so that you can follow me more easily. Maybe we should turn off the heat.
I just did.
You just did?
It
Okay.
should. I turned it down to 55, so it should be shutting off.
Yeah, okay. All right. So as I've said a couple times, there's quite a shift between the first year of studying spirituality, which was more about our classic tradition of spirituality, the great masters and great themes and things like that, which in a way kind of more heavily emphasized interiority and prayer and so forth. Second year we turned towards, turning from the love of God to also the love of neighbor. The implications of spirituality for our life and society. We turn to the external world, and I find in the past that the students really seem to like the second year because it gets down to the nitty-gritty of life and the kinds of things you're going to be facing as deacons in your ministry. How are we to live as a Christian? How are we to minister to many aspects of society? And as now that we have just this lecture and then May and June after this, there isn't much time and there's so much material to do. So we could have spent, my topic today is Catholic social teaching and the economy. Now, we could spend a whole semester just on that. It's a really important topic, and certainly now with the threat of the coronavirus, the impact it's having on our economy and the number of unemployed suddenly we have before us and so forth, you can see how important these issues are. So we have just 3 classes left, this one, May and June, and I have a list of what I call units of input, topics that I plan to include before the end of the year. So I'll take economy today, what the church teaches about the common good, talk about the preferential option for the poor, maybe if I have time talk a little bit about the witness of Dorothy Day, and some of the other attendant questions connected with the church's social teaching on the economy. I don't find teaching by video very easy. I very much like the interchange and the questions and the shared insights and the experience that we have when we're together. So as I get your questions back, maybe I'll be able to answer some of your questions. So thank you for sending them in last week. Other topics that I plan to do before the end of the year. One is the common good, which I may have time to take today. The second is the church's social teaching and the economy, especially the preferential option for the poor, which sometimes there's a bit of controversy about that and misunderstanding. Third, critiques of what's being called neoliberalism. There are some major voices in the Catholic world, such as Thomas Joseph White, a Dominican, and Patrick Deneen from Notre Dame, who's written a book called Why Liberalism Failed. These are more conservative commentators who critique neoliberalism, and in a way, the book that I'll talk about today, I mentioned this book before, The Enchantment of Mammon by Eugene McCarrer from Villanova. It's a critique of neoliberalism, especially our capitalism, raw capitalism, which has run amok many times in our society. I'll talk about the model of Dorothy Day and a new biography about her. Ecology, especially next time the topic will be ecology, care of the earth, and the papal encyclical Laudato Si. And then another topic I'd love to take is cultural criticism, which I think we really need to pay attention to. It's surprising how many people are saying that as we live through the crisis of coronavirus and what it's imposing on our society, maybe it's time for society to press the reset button and start again and consciously remake some of our institutions and look at our values and so forth. So cultural criticism, who are some of the major people writing about this? Some of the voices in the church on this question are very profound. I'd like to talk about liberation theology and the connection between personal transformation and societal transformation or collective transformation. And then the ending class, I intend to talk about what's creating the future and what's the significance of this, and is it just a random process unfolding, or do some of our most insightful and I would say mystical writers in spirituality in the 20th and 21st century have things to say about that? Nominally and most importantly, Teilhard de Chardin. I've been a Teilhardian since the 60s, and I even had a chance to be at the 50th anniversary of Teilhard's death, which was on Easter Sunday a few years ago, 50th anniversary. Ilia Delio, who is a brilliant young Franciscan woman theologian, now at Villanova, and John Hott, a Jesuit, and others. So those are some of the topics I hope to take before the end of the year. All right, the bishops put out a pastoral on the U.S. economy back in 1986, and it's a brilliant piece of work. But I have to say, in 1986, that's 34 years, more than that. 14 plus 20 is 34, 36.
Yeah, that's 34. That's
34.
34 years.
34 years. I don't think I've heard one homily based on it. I mean,
How about what's his name? You know, the one who was a chaplain, Father Sullivan.
Oh yes, right. But maybe at
Our Lady of Lourdes.
At Our Lady of Lourdes. Yes, yes. Maybe Father Sullivan, who used to be chaplain at the Newman Club at SUNY Binghamton. Yes. But if you look at this piece of work, and you'll see the outline on page 2, see that it begins with chapter 1, the Church and the Future of the U.S. Economy. But right before that, it begins with a call to conversion and action. So it's a calling to contemporary disciples of Christ to really listen to the gospel about the option for the poor, care of the poor. Okay. And then the chapter 5 is the commitment to the future. The Christian vocation in the world today challenges to the church and so forth. A commitment to a kingdom of love and justice. So this is a resource which you should, it's 99 pages long, so that's why I'm not giving it to you, but you can buy it in a cheap kind of paperback edition, or you can, the Compendium of Catholic Social Teaching I think has it, or you can print it out online, which is 99 pages, or use it as you need online. But it's something you should study and internalize and really have at your fingertips, so that when you preach, this is something that inspires your preaching. There's some terminology that I'd like to talk about first, because you'll be finding it in some of the reading that you will be doing. One is the term modernity. What do we mean by modernity? Well, modernity is the whole ethos, the whole history as it developed out of Western European history in the 17th, 18th century, particularly the time of the Enlightenment, the French Revolution, and so forth. Modernity put emphasis on overthrowing the old regime, the ancien regime, and aristocrats and the power of the church and so forth. And many of the persons such as Descartes, who rejected the church, even though he grew up in the womb of the church. He, questioned everything, doubt everything. This is the exaltation of reason. Perhaps you've heard a lot of this from Father Doran, who teaches church history, modernity. We all are just immersed in that, and we're soaked with it. It's the culture we grew up with. But now, in the last perhaps 40 years, there's something called postmodernity, which is even a further movement towards doubt and cynicism and rejection of metaphysics itself. Heidegger wrote a book called The End of Metaphysics, and so some of the Catholic philosophers have tried very hard to reassert the importance of metaphysics, and frequently going back to Thomas Aquinas as the chosen spokesperson of Catholic metaphysics. But postmodernity is a cynical, doubting denial that there's any large reason for anything. There's just phenomenon, okay? So that's the climate we're in right now. It affects art and literature and even theology and religious writing and so forth. We have to realize that's the climate that we're living in now. And then the next term on your handout is classic liberalism, by which I mean the liberalism that came out of the French Revolution, which overthrew the monarchy and went to an extreme of exalting reason, as I pointed out. And so one of the critiques of the French Revolution came from Edmund Burke, the English writer. And Edmund Burke is a solid source of conservative thinking, and that individualism can go too far and so forth. I had a very good friend, now deceased, who was very conservative. I mean, a Reagan Republican, and even, further right than that. And so she asked me one time why I was a liberal, and I've told you this story. And it's my background in Minnesota, growing up in a farming and labor family, democratic farmer labor. But I learned to respect classic liberalism's critique in Edmund Burke when I was in college. And so more and more I've been paying attention to spokespersons in the Catholic Church who represent classic or critiques of classic liberalism, such as Thomas Joseph White. And I'll show you how important it is. I'll take a time in a class to talk about the critique of liberalism. And then the next one is neoliberalism, which is even a more extravagant assertion of individual rights above all, for, example, abortion rights and so forth, or property rights. I picked up a little pamphlet on property rights published by the Lord Acton Institute up in Michigan, which is a Catholic foundation. And the most sacred thing in the world, you would think, is property, and so it's a foundation for the kind of capitalism that we have now. And then secularism. We need to do a whole unit on secularism. Charles Taylor is a Catholic social theorist at the University of Toronto. He's written a huge book on secularism. That means a lot of things. It means one thing in France, it means one thing in the United States. I don't think that secularism is bad at all, but it can be militaristically opposed to the church and so forth. All right, so we need to, you probably have questions in the reading that I ask you to do about this kind of terminology. Okay, what I want to now concentrate on for today's lecture is the church, the Catholic social teaching, and the economy. I mentioned a few classes ago this book, which came out perhaps in February, The Enchantments of Mammon, How Capitalism Became the Religion of Modernity, by Eugene McCarrer. It's a 787-page book, and you all encouraged me that I should ask the diocese to buy you each a copy, since it's a monumental investment of $39.95. But believe me, if it comes out in paperback, it's worth having. I certainly haven't read all of it, but I've picked here and there about questions I was interested in. And he spent 20 years writing this book. And it's a critique of what I would call the dark side of capitalism. Pope John Paul II, who grew up under communism, certainly criticized communism and state socialism, but he also criticized the dark side of capitalism, the ruthless power of corporate executives and exploitation of labor and so forth. So what the church has done in articulating Catholic social teaching in regard to these questions is, I said, one of the great treasures of the church and one of the reasons we should be respected. An Episcopal church in England, Episcopal clergyman in England, wrote a book about Christianity and social teaching, totally based on Catholic social teaching, and one of the reviewers in Commonweal said, "Why didn't he mention that we Anglicans have done something about this too?" Well, we shouldn't divide up things like that. At any rate, I'm sure he's going to get resounding criticisms of this study. I don't mean to endorse it all, and I'm trying not to be biased, in my teaching of you, but to raise the questions, and to get you to be thinking about these things. Villanova University is run by the Augustinian order, and the Augustinian priests have, I think, done an extraordinary job of emphasizing Catholic social teaching at Villanova. There's an article on the internet by McCarrer that's mentioned on the handout that I'd like you to read and do a short summary of. It's titled, "You're a Slave to Money, Then You Die," which is a kind of short summary of the thesis of his book. Sounds pretty negative, and actually what I understand, and what I'm sympathetic about is that 50% of the laborers in the United States live from week to week, on a week-to-week paycheck. And so to condemn money, seems, that's kind of an elitist attitude, to stand back and say, well, people are just living for money and pleasure and, aggrandizement of properties and bigger cars. And, well, there's people who sweat for it, but So he says, you're a slave to money, then you die, in the Church Life Journal, and you've read things from the Church Life Journal. I find the edge on it a little bit uncomfortable. You know, I grew up in a family which struggled to pay a mortgage. You know, my father worked on the railroad, plus being a farmer. Money didn't come easy. And I remember in grade school being told I couldn't get a new blouse for a field day because we didn't have the money, you know. So I think Eugene McCarter, you know, he's trying hard to punch the bad side of capitalism and talk about reforms, but it could be easily misunderstood. One of his main arguments is that the kingdom of God has been replaced by capitalism as the consummation of history. And he goes into maybe half of the book arguing about that. You know, that, well, it goes back to the old Calvinist Puritan idea that, you know, if you're prosperous, that means God has blessed you. You know, I think that kind of naivete is around not much anymore, although there's that TV preacher who's preaching that nowadays. He's a very, very popular preacher, Joel somebody.
Jerry Falwell?
No, somebody more contemporary.
I don't
Joel
know.
somebody, I can't remember his name. But he says, you know, your prosperity is a sign that God is blessing you. So, I don't know what he says to the poor or the people who've gone bankrupt or, you know. Anyhow, to make that connection between prosperity, finances, and where we are before God, I think is extremely, extremely wrong. He criticizes, as the expression of the ideology that's behind this kind of capitalism, he calls it neoliberalism. Certainly Reagan and Margaret Thatcher and Bill Clinton were neoliberals. You know, the most important thing was a prosperous economy. He says it's the attempt to remake human life in the image and likeness of the market, not in the image and likeness of God. It is a moral and metaphysical imagination in which capitalism and property relations provide the template for understanding the world. It's the whole ethos, you know. I mean, I've known a couple of people in my life who's, you know, they're sitting all day watching the TV and the stock exchange reports, the little tape coming across, you know, so that they can check where their investments are. Seems a bit disordered if that's the only thing in your life, okay? He says the market is the ontological architecture of the cosmos. It's idolatry. Is that true? You know, we kind of naively, if you get into a discussion with people and you say, well, you know, there's capitalism, there's socialism, and there's different variety of economic systems. Americans will always say, well, capitalism works the best. It's honestly the best system. I kind of believe so. You know, I'm not a anarchist or a extreme, you know, socialist or anything like that. But unbridled capitalism can be cruel and harsh and destroy people. He says, under neoliberal auspices, the market becomes the latest modern surrogate for traditional divinity. Takes the place of God. I mean, that's quite an argument. I'm very eager to see the reviews of this book, especially from very good commentators. And by the way, it was Harvard that published the book. And if anybody pushes that ethos in the world, it's Harvard University. You know. And I was at a conference down in Pennsylvania last fall about Catholicism and higher education, and the general feeling of the professors there who teach in Catholic universities is that the whole thing has been perverted because the university, the college is now seen as preparing people to make a good livelihood. Not to educate people in the liberal arts or to think well or anything like that. That's the American model. A friend of mine who went to Oxford got his degree in history, and well, he had a family, so he had to get a good job. He didn't go into the academic world. He went into business advising. He says, that's the only way I can make money. But he said the interesting thing is that the business world in England tends to hire people who are trained in the liberal arts at Cambridge and Oxford, which says something. You know, that, in other words, those skills, those ways of thinking can transfer even into the worlds of finance and high capitalism and so forth. So, he says the neoliberalism defines servitude to pecuniary values as the purest expression of freedom. Yeah, that's maybe bondage, you know, to one's bank account, and, you know, worry about whether you're, well, think of 2008 when we had a depression in this country. A couple of my very good friends lost a bit of money at that time, and it was quite a shock, you know. So if, you know, your security is based on that, this is what he's trying to get at, is that it's distorted our whole way of life and some of our major institutions, including family and education and so forth. He says the shift in the trajectory of capital away from production, industry, to finance is one of the big problems. And that was behind what happened in 2008, the bloated mortgage industry and so forth that just all of a sudden collapsed. You know, when we live in a world of false bonds and, you know, I forget what they're called when you take bonds and sell them in another market, another market, another market. You're selling finance. You're not selling goods. You're not selling actual production. So this is a huge problem. Do we see the person as imago Dei or the entrepreneurial self? Wow. As I say, I myself don't know if I entirely agree with him, but he's pointing at something that's trying to nudge people. I think every American bishop ought to have a copy of this, you know, and be able to converse with it. Somebody who is very conversant along these lines is Thomas McGovern, who is the bishop of San Diego. He has a PhD in economics, and so he speaks continually about Catholic social teaching in regard to the economy and refugees and so forth. This is an important comment, and it's a bit complicated. Although many think of our time as a secular age of irony, disenchantment, and suspicion of meta-narrative, in other words, a big philosophy or overview, we just don't believe there's any of that. And despite its profane, technocratic veneer of econometrics and policy wonkery, language is a bit challenging. Neoliberalism is a story about the nature of reality, you know. If dollar signs are written on our eyeballs, and that's how we look at everything, you know, it makes us bondage to a certain view of reality that he calls idolatry. As I said before, we in the United States too easily say that capitalism is great and it's superb, it outreaches any kind of economic system in the world, and we don't see the dark side. You know, we look at China and Mao Zedong and so forth, and we see it as draconian and hard-handed and destroyed life. It certainly did. You know, it was inhumane. What do you call it when they took the doctors out into the country?
Cultural re-education.
Cultural re-education and so forth. That's even still going on in China. Okay, all right. I don't mean to approve of that, and yet the way Mao Zedong took peasant China into the 20th century and has made it one of the great competitors with us in the world in terms of production, it's just absolutely remarkable. Okay, now, what was the human cost for that? You know, should it have happened? I don't know. Are people better off, better educated? That's a point for discussion. But it was state socialism, It was a hard-handed approach. The Russian 5-year plans and so forth. Pope John Paul II roundly criticized state socialism. He lived under communism, which was a harsh system, and deprived people and dehumanized them and so forth, and was anti-religion. A Polish Ursuline sister I knew said that one of the reasons that the Polish were so religious when she grew up was it a way of being anti-communist, because religion was where they could stand for their freedom and dignity as a person and so forth. So John Paul II had lived under the severity of communism and yet became probably the first spokesman from the papacy about the demonic side of capitalism. He says, MacArthur says, the U.S. has had a modified capitalism since the New Deal. See, the kind of raw capitalism of after World War I, and then Hoover and the economy kind of collapsing. I remember my father talking about the Hoover Flats, the homeless people in the thousands living under bridges in Minneapolis, because Minneapolis-St. Paul is divided by the Mississippi River. So there are an enormous number of bridges going from northern part of Minneapolis through to St. Paul. Under these bridges, tents and homeless people, as there are homeless people under the freeways in California. Okay? This is one of the great problems in California with the virus, is that they had to do something with these encampments of homeless people, because that's how the virus was spreading so quickly. So the U.S. has a modified capitalism, and in a sense, the big political question between our two parties nowadays is how much modification of the capitalism do we want? Little in terms of the Republicans, or more modification in terms of the Democrats. And then you have someone like Bernie Sanders coming along, who talks about socialism, scares everybody, But most of the countries of Western Europe are democratic socialists, They're democratic, but their style of government is socialist, okay? So we need to develop a lot more of subtlety in our understanding of what we mean by socialism. I think it was John Paul II who popularized the phrase, if you want peace, work for justice. If you want peace, work for justice. A friend of mine, actually he's a cousin down in Tennessee, who does a lot of activism for social justice and neighborhood rights, and he's into everything. And he actually was one of the city managers for Syracuse. He wrote to me last week and said, I'll work for justice, you pray for peace. Which I thought, well, I work for justice too, just in giving this course. Also, on your handout, I've got a few comments from an article called From Jesus' Socialism to Capitalistic Christianity by Gregory Paul. The author believes that there's a profound contradiction that's developed within modern conservative Christianity. It's like that group, the Lord Acton Institute up in Michigan, which so strongly talked about property above everything. The author of that article, and I asked you to look it up on the internet, he says, do we think that the creator of the universe favors freewheeling, deregulated, union-busting, minimal taxes, especially for wealthy investors, plutocrat-boosting capitalism as the ideal earthly scheme? Well, I don't think anybody could look at the gospel and say that's what God wants, Jesus Christ does not want a freewheeling, deregulated, union-busting, minimal taxes, especially for wealthy investors, plutocrat-boosting capitalism. Okay. Many of these Christian capitalists are ardent followers of Ayn Rand, who wrote Atlas Shrugged. who was a hardcore atheist. When I taught high school back in the 60s, I had a senior class called Senior Social Problems. And one of my most brilliant students went to college, and I guess she got her degree in economics and finance and so forth, and got a job on Wall Street. So when I went to Fordham, I looked her up when she was living in Manhattan and met her down on Wall Street. And she admitted to me that she had become a complete disciple of Ayn Rand. Unbelievable. I have her now as a Facebook contact, and I've been meaning to ask her, where are you now? I don't want to get into an argument, though, wherever she is. He says, to understand why the pro-capitalist stance of many modern religious conservatives is at odds with Christian doctrine, we need to start with the Gospels. We simply have to look at the Gospel, What did it mean that, Jesus said it's hard for a wealthy person, like a camel going through the eye of a needle? Well, they say the eye of the needle is actually a place out in the desert where it was hard for camels to go through. Well, but it's an analogy, doesn't say it's impossible, but it's difficult. And what the church teaches is the responsibility of those who have assets and so forth to help those who are more needy. He says Jesus is no free marketer. Okay, we need to have restrictions if necessary on the market. Raw Calvinism, prosperity as a sign of God's blessing, is certainly not Christian teaching. Catholic social teaching decries the excesses of unrestrained capital at the expense of social justice. Pope John Paul II, Pope Benedict XVI, and Pope Francis all criticized the dark side of capitalism. And I remember when Pope Benedict XVI took office, he was quite critical of liberation theology, because he had been head of the Holy Office and was sort of the watchdog for the Vatican, and so some of the things that were coming out of Latin America that seemed to very much criticize North American capitalism and European capitalism and so forth, he became very uncomfortable with. But as he experienced, especially as he traveled, finally, I remember the day when he gave a talk in Australia and approved of liberation theology. He did counsel about, the angry side of Marxism is not something we can identify with, but we can learn from Marxism about analyzing social structures, the roots of inequality in society, and so forth. The next question that author asks is the early Christian community in the Acts of the Apostles a good model? Well, probably not, because it's a very idealized portrait. Most scripture scholars say that's not, a reporter's description. It's a kind of cleaned up version of what the early Christian community what they were probably attempting to do is to hold things in common, how much it worked and so forth. But we have lots of proof from all sorts of intentional communities that holding things in common doesn't work, except for religious communities. Okay, so there's something deeper than a social purpose. It's the consecration to God. Christianity did appeal to the poor and the marginalized, and there are some very interesting studies of early Christianity, first few centuries in Rome, for example. The people it appealed to were the lower classes and the poor and the marginalized and so forth. We had a priest from India here a few years ago, and he said in his parish in India, which is mostly, the lowest class in India, the lowest caste?
Untouchables?
The untouchables. Many, many untouchables in his very rural parish in India. When he talks about, in fact, then in Christ there is neither freeman nor slave and so forth and so forth, he sees a light shine on their face. That's where they can find their dignity and acceptance and so forth. Now to make a few points about the common good. The common good is one of the 7 basic principles of Catholic social thought. And I don't think nowadays, with the way we have to deal with the threat of the COVID-19 virus threat, this is certainly making us very conscious of the common good. That if we're careless about who we contact, and not washing our hands and so forth, it comes down to basic personal hygiene for the sake of the common good. This is extremely important. There are 3 essential elements in the Catholic Catechism regarding the common good. The first is respect for the individual. Second, the social well-being and development of the group as a whole. And quite a few of the commentators on this aspect of the common good point out the group is no longer just our neighborhood or our nation, but it's the international community, because we're living in a global world. And so we have a responsibility for the whole world. We certainly should feel that in prayer, and I know that many parishes do in their prayer life and so forth, pray for the situations around the world. And then the third aspect of the common good is peace, which results from the stability of a just society. The common good's conceptual roots lie in Greek and Roman philosophy as the goal of political life, the good of the city, the polis, and the task entrusted to civic leaders, the responsibility for peace and justice in society. The last thing I'd like to talk about this morning is a group that went out of business in 2018, but was a model, I think, of what can be done in pooling resources and study and so forth to work on issues in society, and that group was called the Center of Concern. It was in Washington, D.C. It was founded by Jesuits, inspired by Pedro Arrupe, and also the National Conference of Catholic Bishops, especially Cardinal Bernardin was important. And the major Jesuit forming it and getting it started was Peter Henriot, who's written on all sorts of topics on social justice, including the option for the poor, which I'd like to talk about in a minute. Eventually, he was forced to leave. He was considered to be too unsettling. He was right in Washington, under the nose of Congress and the White House and so forth. And so eventually he was asked to leave the Center for Concern. It went on for I think he left in 2012. It went on for another 6 years, but it closed in 2018. The center's purpose was to study issues of development, justice, and peace from a global perspective. When he was forced to resign, he went to Zimbabwe and is working on justice and peace issues in Zimbabwe. From the start, the center convened discussions regarding development, justice, and peace from a global perspective, reading the sign of the times and supporting the United Nations, Catholic social tradition, and other frameworks for such issues as population, hunger, environment, poverty, habitat, science and technology, and women's empowerment. Well, one of the documents by Peter Henriot that I looked over in the last weekend was his little book. It's only about 30 pages, a pamphlet actually, on the option for the poor. And you will hear that word, option for the poor. It doesn't mean one choice among others. It means it's a basic choice it's not an option. It's an absolute requirement of the gospel to put a primacy on caring for the poor and the needy and so forth. And also not doing it just in a remote way, $5 check to, a missionary society or something like that, but hands-on work with the poor when it's possible. I worked at the Catholic Worker from 1969 to 70 and lived there while I was doing my first year of graduate work at Fordham. And the hands-on work for the poor is not easy. I have friends in Syracuse who work in a hands-on way with the poor. The poor are not easy to work with sometimes, and often mentally disturbed and rough people, and it can be dangerous. But that's demanded of us. Dorothy Day at the Catholic Worker used to say, people from North Dakota send us great big boxes of clothing, and there must be poor in North Dakota. So we've got to think very concretely about who are the poor among us. And one of my very good friends who had a very good income, actually, herself and her husband, they quietly found out people who were sending children to college and helped them out. And another older lady that I knew in Binghamton, she was a retired Army nurse, and she knew a single woman who was raising 4 children and had to educate them, send them off to college, and they all got higher degrees in nursing, and one became a doctor and a lawyer and so forth. She helped out with their education quietly. And another friend of mine, Helen McAndrews, who some of you might have known in Binghamton, she worked at the state hospital as a secretary and telephone operator. And she knew patients who died at the state hospital who did not have families and no one to bury them, so she would pay for their funerals. So, to visit the prisoners, to bury the dead, this is the type of life that the gospel calls us to. There was an article I came across just this morning titled, Matthew 25 is not a complicated mission. It's not a complicated mission. When I met Dorothy Day the first time in St. Paul in the spring of 1969, I was at a friend's house, and my friend had been a Catholic worker volunteer in New York City, so she invited Dorothy to supper when Dorothy was in St. Paul. And my friend Georges turned to Dorothy Day and said, what's your favorite part of Scripture? What does it all come down to? And Dorothy said, without a bat of the eye, that's easy, Matthew 25, I was in prison, you visited me, I was hungry, you fed me, and so forth. So the whole question of getting to know the treasury of Catholic social teaching, the more than 100 years now of wonderful encyclicals and so forth, this is where we can hold our head up. The church has gone through some bad times recently, but this is where I think we excel. And when we look at history and see the number of selfless missionaries and nurses and teaching orders and nursing orders and people like Catherine of Siena and Elizabeth of Hungary and so forth, who deliberately took on caring for the poor. Martin of Tours, who was it?
Martin of Tours, yeah, he was black.
He was black, and he worked on the slave ships.
From Brazil, I think, wasn't he?
He worked on the slave ships. So these are great models for inspiring young people, And I think to myself, I kind of think we don't do very well with teaching catechetics to teenage kids nowadays. But, there's something that younger people really want. They want a better world. They're idealistic. And if we want to show them a map about how to do this and what are the values, what are the objectives, this is what we should be teaching in catechetics to young people. So the assignment for the next class from the textbook, and it's just from volume 1 this time, 2 essays. It's from Handbook of Spirituality for Ministers. It's essay 12 by Father Donders, a Maryknoll priest, on interreligious dialogue and so forth, how we relate to other religions. Ministering in a globalizing world, a challenge of a cross-cultural spirituality. I've been involved in that quite a bit, and Sister Sheila, who's videotaping this, has been involved in it too. This is something the Benedictines and Cistercians have been very much, in fact the Vatican asked Benedictines and Cistercians to take leadership to create a bridge between traditions. So, interestingly, one of the most important experts in the Vatican on Islam is a Benedictine monk from England. Okay, then the other essay, besides the one by Donders, which is essay 12, the other essay is 29. Catherine Gugerty, From Guilt to Gratitude, Spiritual Ministry with Persons Who Are Poor and Homeless. Now, maybe some of you will not, but I think all of you, if you're in parish work, to some extent, along the way, you're going to be dealing with the poor and the homeless, at least in your region. So that, I think, is very important. So, all right, that's it for this morning.